Chapter 1. A quiet piece of black stone. There is something quietly remarkable about a piece of coal. You can hold one in your hand, if you have ever done so, and it feels heavier than you might expect. It is smooth in places, almost waxy at the surface, with a dark luster that catches the light in a particular way. It is not glamorous. It is not precious in the conventional sense. No one has ever worn a piece of coal in a ring or given it as a gift in a velvet box. And yet, this ordinary, somber stone shaped the world we live in more completely than almost anything else humanity ever found beneath the ground. Tonight, we are going to sit quietly with that piece of coal. We are going to follow it, slowly, without hurry, from the ancient swamps where it was formed, through the long centuries when people first noticed it, lying on hillsides, into the mines and furnaces and canal boats and railway wagons of the great industrial age, and on to the quieter years of its long, gradual farewell. There is no need to rush. The story of coal is a patient story. It was made slowly, over hundreds of millions of years, and it unfolded slowly across British history, century after quiet century. So, we will take our time with it tonight. The fire beside us is burning low. The room is still. Let us begin at the very beginning. Chapter 2. Coal before industry. The coal we are thinking about tonight, the coal that powered Britain's mills and heated its parlours and lit its gas lamps, was formed during what geologists call the Carboniferous period. Most of the main deposits in England are referred to as the coal measures, laid down during the Westphalian stage of that long era, somewhere between 313 and 306 million years ago. What existed then was quite different from the Britain we know. The land that would one day become these islands sat closer to the equator at tropical latitudes. There were no mountains, no cities, no people. Instead, there were vast freshwater swamps extending across wide river deltas and behind coastal barriers. Ferns and enormous tree-like plants grew densely in that warm, wet air, club mosses and horsetails reaching heights that seem extraordinary to us now, filling a landscape that had no autumn, no frost, no seasons as we understand them. When those plants died, they fell into the water of the swamps and began to decay. But in the absence of oxygen, that decay was slow and incomplete. Over many thousands of years, layers of plant matter accumulated as peat. Then mud would settle over the peat and more vegetation would grow, and in time, the slow processes of burial and pressure and geological heat would begin their work. The Northern Mine Research Society, which has documented the geology of coal across the British Isles in careful detail, notes that it took approximately 10,000 years for peat to accumulate to a depth of 10 meters, and that 10 meters of peat would eventually compress to around 1 meter of coal. The weight of later sediments pressing down from above, the heat from deep within the earth, the slow and immense compression of geological time. All of these forces worked together over epochs that dwarf the entirety of human history to transform soft peat into the hard, energy-dense material that miners would one day extract. The deposition of coal was not a simple, continuous process. Deltas subsided, the sea sometimes advanced, tectonic events uplifted and altered the landscape. These interruptions created what geologists call cyclothems, repeating sequences of swamp, subsidence, flooding, sediment infill, and swamp again, laid down one above another over millions of years. faulting in the Earth's crust caused variations in thickness and depth. In many places across Britain, seams eventually reached the surface. They outcropped along hillsides and valley edges, and it was there that the first human encounters with coal would take place. The coal-bearing regions of Britain are largely known to us. The great coalfields of South Wales, the northeast of England, around Northumberland and Durham, Yorkshire, Lancashire, the Scottish lowlands, the Midlands. There were also smaller, older seams. Namurian coals in the Mid and North Pennines, locally important for domestic fuel and lime burning. Bajocian coals worked in the North Yorkshire moors, even lignite in parts of Devon and Kent. Each of these places has its own character, its own geology, its own story. They are different in rock type and depth and seam quality, and the communities that eventually formed around them carried those differences in their working practices and their local cultures. And all of them, at different times and in different ways, would become the foundation of industries that people at the time could not have anticipated. But that came later. For a long time, a very long time, coal was simply something that lay in the ground, patient and dense and waiting. Chapter 3. Surface seams, bell pits, early digging. The earliest coal gathering in Britain was not really mining at all. Where seams broke the surface, people simply picked up what was there. Pieces of coal lying on a hillside, eroded from an outcrop by wind and rain, dark and heavy among the grasses and roots. These were carried home, and they burned hot and steadily, lasting longer than wood. The Romans, who occupied much of Britain from the 1st to the 4th century of the Common Era, are known to have used coal in their hearths and forges. Archaeological evidence has been found at numerous Roman sites, including military forts along Hadrian's Wall, which ran close to the coal-bearing strata of Northumberland. But it was not yet the foundation of an economy. In the medieval period, as demand for fuel gradually increased and woodland in some regions was depleted by centuries of clearance for agriculture and charcoal burning, surface outcrops began to be worked more deliberately. Where a seam broke through a hillside or cliff face, a drift could be driven directly in. Where the seam ran beneath a flat surface, a small pit could be sunk. One early and widespread technique was the bell pit. A shaft would be sunk vertically down to a seam, perhaps 10 or 15 meters deep, then widened outward at the base in the shape of a bell. The coal hacked away as far as was safely possible before the roof became too precarious. When one bell pit was abandoned, a new one would be begun nearby, following the seam a little further along. On some hillsides in old coalfield regions, you can still see the shallow depressions left by these early workings. Dozens of them, scattered across a field, gentle dimples in the landscape, soft and overgrown now with grass and heather, the only surface trace of what happened there centuries ago. Working a bell pit was simple in concept, but physically demanding. The shaft was dug by hand with picks and shovels, and the coal, once broken free, was lifted to the surface in baskets, hauled on a rope by a windlass, a wooden drum on a frame, turned by a worker standing above. A pit might be worked by 2 or 3 people, one below cutting coal, one hauling, perhaps one sorting and stacking at the surface. It was family-scale work, uncomplicated and direct. The coal that came out of these early workings served local needs: a household's fire, a nearby smithy, a lime kiln on the edge of a field. As demand grew in towns and cities, particularly London, which had consumed wood from its surrounding forests and was increasingly short of it, the coal industry became more organized. The northeast of England, around the rivers Tyne and Wear, was discovered to have extensive and accessible seams. By the 13th and 14th centuries, coal was being extracted from the shores of the Tyne, loaded onto boats, and carried southward along the coast to London. This was the beginning of the sea coal trade that would eventually make Newcastle one of the most important ports in Britain. Chapter 4. The Minemouth, Tools, the Working Day. As demand gradually increased, the workings grew deeper and more organized. By the 16th and 17th centuries, larger operations had developed in Northumberland and Durham, in Scotland and in Wales. These were no longer just surface scratching. They were real mines, with shaft headings and underground passages, and a workforce whose lives were defined by the work below ground. The tools were simple and largely unchanged across many centuries. The pick was the fundamental instrument, the tool by which a miner separated coal from the seam it had occupied for 300 million years. The shovel moved broken coal into baskets or tubs. Wooden props held the roof above the working area. A wedge could help split coal along its natural cleavage, and a hammer drove the wedge home. Light underground was provided by tallow candles. In some seams where gas was not a hazard, these candles worked well enough. In others, the flame that provided light was also the thing most likely to cause disaster if it encountered an accumulation of fire damp. The contradiction between the need for light and the danger of fire was one of the defining tensions of underground work for centuries until a solution was eventually found. A miner working a low seam might spend much of his day on his side or on his knees, working in a space perhaps 3 feet high, with the coal face before him and the roof pressing close above. The air would be warm, warmer than the surface in winter, sometimes oppressively warm in summer, especially at depth. It would carry the smell of coal dust and damp and candle smoke. The sounds of the mine were particular. The regular impact of a pick striking coal, the scrape of a shovel on a stone floor, the creak of a wooden prop taking the weight of the roof above, the quiet trickling of water along the floor of a passage. There were main roadways, the wider passages through which coal was hauled from the working faces to the shaft bottom. From these branched the narrower working places, known variously as stalls, boards, or headings, depending on the region and the period. The experienced miner, the hewer, would undercut the seam with his pick, creating a void at the base, then work upward and inward until a section of coal could be brought down in manageable pieces. Moving coal from the face to the surface was its own separate task. Putters or hurriers, often boys and young men, and in some coalfields, women and girls as well, dragged or pushed loaded tubs through passages that were sometimes too low to stand upright in. Children served as trappers too, sitting alone in the darkness beside ventilation doors, opening them when a tub came past, then closing them again. It was long and lonely work, and the darkness of a coal mine is a particular kind of darkness, complete and dense, without the faint glimmer that moonlight or starlight can give even on the darkest outdoor night. Legislation from the mid-19th century onward gradually addressed the worst of these conditions. The Mines Act of 1842 prohibited the employment of women and girls underground and set a minimum age of 10 for boys. Later acts raised that minimum further. The working day in a coal mine was not filled with dramatic events. Much of it was simply labor, methodical, repetitive, careful. A hewer making his cuts, the scrape of a shovel on a stone floor, the creak of a wooden prop taking weight, the soft rhythm of coal dropping into a basket. These were quiet, patient sounds, repeated over and over through long hours underground, in air that smelled of stone and damp and the faint, mineral sweetness of coal. Chapter 5. Wagons, Packhorses, Canals, Coal Staithes. Getting coal out of the ground was only the first challenge. Getting it to where it was needed was another matter entirely. In the earliest period, pack animals managed the transport. A horse or a donkey, loaded with baskets of coal, moving slowly along a track from the pit to a nearby town. It worked, but it was slow and modest in volume. Even a long train of pack animals could not move coal in the quantities that an expanding urban population would eventually require. Where rivers were navigable, they were put to use. Coal from the Tyne Valley found its way to London by sea, loaded onto flat-bottomed boats called keels on the river, transferred to collier ships at wharves near the river mouth, then carried southward around the headlands of the North Sea coast and into the Thames estuary. So important was this coastwise trade that London's supply of coal was given its own name: sea coal. By the 17th century, thousands of tons each year were moving through Newcastle alone, bound for the capital's hearths and smithies and bakeries and breweries. But reaching inland areas with no navigable river remained a problem. Roads in Britain were poorly suited to heavy loads, unpaved, rutted, seasonally impassable in bad weather, and steadily worsened by the iron wheels of heavy wagons. The answer, when it came, was water brought where it was needed, on a controlled and level course, through engineering that was ambitious and ultimately transformative. A canal boat could carry close to 40 tons of cargo, moved at a steady walking pace by a single horse on the towpath, along a level waterway engineered to avoid the gradients that defeated road transport. The Bridgewater Canal, completed in 1761 and funded by Francis Egerton, the Duke of Bridgewater, is often cited as the catalyst for the great canal building era of the later 18th century. It was engineered by James Brindley, a millwright who had never built a canal before, but proved remarkably capable. He designed tunnels driven directly into the coal mines at Worsley, allowing loaded boats to float out from underground workings directly onto the canal, removing the need to transfer coal to surface wagons before loading it onto boats. The canal included the Barton Aqueduct, which carried the waterway over the River Irwell, a structure that impressed visitors from across Britain and Europe. The practical result was an immediate reduction of around 50% in the cost of shipping coal to Manchester. Between 1760 and 1800, of the 150 canal acts passed by Parliament, 90 were specifically connected to coal transport. By 1800, Britain's canal network extended over 6,000 kilometres. At the waterside, coal arrived at structures called staithes, timber or stone platforms from which coal could be transferred directly from wagons into waiting boats or ships. These were working places, dusty and black with coal dust, with the sound of coal tipping into a hold echoing across the water. Quietly purposeful, the dark hulls of the waiting boats sitting low, the patience of horses in the traces, the routine of workers going about a task they had done many times before. At night, a staithe by the river might be lit by lanterns, their reflections broken on the moving water, the loaded boats waiting for the morning tide. The canals had their limitations. They could freeze solid in a cold winter. A hot, dry summer could lower water levels uncomfortably. Different sections were built to different dimensions, so a boat suited to one canal might not fit the locks of another. They were a collection of local and regional systems rather than a unified national network. These limitations would eventually tell against them when a faster alternative appeared. Chapter 6. Household Coal. Long before coal-powered industry, it heated homes. In Britain, the shift from wood fires to coal fires happened gradually and at different times in different places. It depended on geography, how close a household was to a coal field or a coast where sea coal arrived, and on economics, since coal was not always cheap. It also depended on infrastructure. Coal burned differently from wood, and a fireplace designed for open log fires did not easily accommodate coal without adaptation. The hearth was the centerpiece of the home for millennia. The word itself comes from the Old English Hearth, meaning household or settled home. The fire that burned within it was more than warmth. It was continuity, safety, the gathering place of the family. For the Anglo-Saxons, the hearth fire was something to be kept burning always, a symbolic presence connected to household spirits and the welfare of the family. For the Tudors, an elaborate fireplace was a mark of wealth and standing, a piece of architecture that announced the prosperity of its owner. As coal became more available, particularly in urban areas where wood was expensive and hard to obtain, hearth design adapted. Georgian homes began incorporating coal-burning fireplaces with iron grates and chimneys suited to the different burn characteristics of coal. Coal burns differently from wood. It requires more draft, air drawn upward from below the fire. The fireplaces that appeared in Georgian parlors and bedrooms were smaller and more efficient than the great open hearths of earlier centuries, because coal's heat was more concentrated. The Weald and Downland Living Museum, whose collection spans around 1,000 years of domestic life, traces this shift clearly. The move from wood to coal made fireplaces smaller, less smoky, and allowed for specific rooms with individual fireplaces, parlors, studies, rather than a single communal hearth warming an entire household. By the Victorian era, the Industrial Revolution had made cast iron stoves and coal-burning fireplaces affordable enough that even lower-income households could maintain a warm home. Victorian society placed great moral and emotional weight on the domestic hearth, the symbol of family life and stability. Coal made it possible for this symbolism to be available to a much wider part of the population. In the back streets of industrial cities, small, terraced houses would each have their fireplace in the front room. Coal was delivered weekly by the coalman on a horse-drawn cart, tipped with a rumble and a cloud of black dust into the coal bunker or cellar. It was measured in hundredweights, and the coalman's arrival was as regular a part of household routine as the baker's cart or the milkman's bottles. There was a particular smell to a coal fire that those who grew up with them remember distinctly. Slightly sulphurous when it first caught, then settling into something warmer and more complex as the fire established itself. The blue and orange flames on an iron grate. The occasional crack of a piece splitting in the heat. The way a small room felt different when the fire was properly going. Smaller, warmer, gathered around that one point of light, with the rest of the house cold and dark beyond the door. Coal gave the 19th century household a particular sensory texture. It needed regular attention, poking, banking up before bed, raking out the ash in the morning. Managing a coal fire well was a small daily practice, part of the practical knowledge of domestic life, learned from childhood and passed between generations without being written down. Chapter 7. Steam Engines and Growing Appetite. The most consequential development in the history of coal was the invention of the steam engine, and the relationship between the two things was circular from the very beginning, because the steam engine was invented, in part, to solve a problem caused by mining coal itself. As mines were dug deeper in the 17th century, water became the central difficulty. Groundwater seeped into every underground working. Flooding was one of the most serious dangers of work below ground. The deeper a mine went, the more water accumulated at the bottom, and the more effort was required to remove it. Human labor and horse engines could manage modest quantities, but neither was adequate for a mine of any serious depth. Thomas Savery had patented a steam-powered device in 1698, describing it in a book with the title The Miner's Friend, intended specifically to raise water from mines. But it had no moving parts, relied on condensing steam to create a vacuum, and could lift water only about 9 meters, making it useful only in the shallowest workings. A number of explosions made mine owners wary, and very few were ever installed. It was Thomas Newcomen, a Devonshire ironmonger, who developed the first successful piston-based steam engine, installing it at a mine in or just before 1712. He called it an atmospheric engine. It is also sometimes called a beam engine from its distinctive rocking motion. Steam from a boiler filled the cylinder and pushed the piston upward. Cold water was then sprayed in, condensing the steam and creating a vacuum below the piston. The weight of the atmosphere pressing down pushed the piston back with considerable force. Through a rocking beam above, like a great mechanical seesaw, this downward stroke was converted into an upward pull on a rod in the mine shaft, lifting water from the bottom. When water turns to steam, it expands approximately 1,500 times in volume. When condensed back in a confined space, the resulting vacuum is powerful enough to move a heavy piston against real resistance. The National Museum of Scotland holds a Newcomen engine in its collection, 9.5 meters tall and weighing 20 tons, originally from Caprington Colliery in Ayrshire. Parts for it were first supplied by the Carron Company of Falkirk in 1781, at a cost of £352. It worked continuously at the colliery for 90 years, needing only a replacement cast iron beam around 1837 and several new boilers across its long life. By the time Newcomen died in 1729, at least 100 engines of his design were in use across Europe. The need to drain coal mines had led, as the National Coal Mining Museum observes, to the development of the steam engine about a century before it was first used for transport. Between 1763 and 1776, James Watt made a series of improvements that transformed the engine from a specialized mine drainage device into something with almost unlimited application. His first key innovation was a separate condensation chamber, apart from the main cylinder, which remained continuously hot. He added an insulating jacket and later a crankshaft and flywheel to convert the engine's back-and-forth motion into smooth, rotary motion. These improvements together reduced coal consumption by around 75%. When Watt's patents expired in 1800, development accelerated. William Trevithick built a high-pressure engine in which all the power came from the expansion of steam itself, with no need for a separate condenser, lighter, faster, and potentially mobile. These engines could run at much higher speeds and generate more power for a given size and weight. They did not need a constant large supply of cooling water, giving the possibility of making them truly portable. The implications of a mobile steam engine were profound, and they were first realized in the context of coal. At Middleton Colliery in Leeds, John Blenkinsop designed steam locomotives in 1812 to haul coal along an iron railway, the first to run on a commercially viable basis in the world. They hauled 90 tons of coal at 4 miles per hour, a phenomenal advance, particularly at a time when the Napoleonic Wars had made horses scarce and fodder expensive. George Stephenson visited and observed. The lessons he took fed directly into his own subsequent work. By 1825, the Stockton and Darlington Railway opened. By the 1840s and 1850s, the railway network was spreading across Britain at a pace that left the canal proprietors with little to celebrate. By 1870, steam power was providing 90% of the horsepower for British industry. 1 horsepower from a steam engine was estimated to be equivalent to the sustained effort of 21 manual workers. By that year, steam power in Britain was collectively delivering the equivalent of 43 million manual workers. The Science and Industry Museum in Manchester describes how factory owners installed coal-fired steam engines to power their mills, freeing factory locations from dependence on rivers. A whole cotton mill might be driven by a single large engine linked to thousands of spindles or hundreds of looms. Over 100 cotton mills had been established in Manchester alone by the 1850s, their chimneys rising above the rooftops in a forest of brick. In 1709, Abraham Darby at Colebrookdale in Shropshire had made a discovery that added another vast dimension to coal's importance. He found that coke, a purified form of coal produced by heating coal in sealed ovens to drive off impurities, leaving a high-carbon material that burns hotter and cleaner than charcoal, could smelt iron ore effectively at scale. Annual iron production in Britain grew from around 2,500 tons in the early 1700s to 28,000 tons by 1750, to 180,000 tons by 1800, and 2.5 million tons by 1850. The coal-coke-iron relationship was the material foundation upon which bridges, railways, steam engines themselves, and the machinery of modernity were built. Chapter 8. Safety lamps, ventilation, underground order. The expanding appetite for coal meant mines went deeper, and deeper mines brought new dangers. Among the most serious was what miners called fire damp, a flammable gas, predominantly methane, which seeped from coal seams into the underground workings. In small concentrations, fire damp was not immediately dangerous. In sufficient concentrations in poorly ventilated areas, it became explosive in the presence of a flame. A candle flame touching air containing sufficient fire damp could cause an explosion with devastating effect, bringing down sections of roof, burning the oxygen from the air, killing those nearby. In the coal mines of the northeast of England in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a series of serious explosions caused terrible loss of life in communities that were tightly bound to the industry. Whole families worked below ground, several generations at the same colliery, and when an accident happened underground, the consequences were felt by every household in the village. In 1815, Humphrey Davy, one of the most celebrated chemists in Britain, was approached by the rector of Bishop Wearmouth, near Newcastle, and asked if science could find a means of lighting coal mines safely. In an intense period of work from mid-October to December of 1815, conducted in the basement laboratory of the Royal Institution in London, Davy made a series of prototype lamps. He discovered that an explosion would not pass through a tube of sufficiently narrow diameter. The metal walls absorb the heat of the flame faster than it can propagate through the space. This principle was the key to the solution. The design he arrived at was simple: a basic oil lamp enclosed within a cylinder of wire gauze. The holes in the gauze allowed light to pass through and air to reach the flame. But the metal of the gauze absorbed heat from any flame that formed within it, preventing that flame from igniting the surrounding gas. If fire damp was present, the flame inside the lamp would change in character, extending upward, perhaps turning blue, giving the miner a warning without igniting the gas outside the gauze. The lamp was tested at Hebburn Colliery in January 1816, and it worked. It quickly went into production. The Royal Institution notes that the introduction of the safety lamp immediately decreased fatalities per million tons of coal produced, and also increased the amount of coal that could be produced by opening access to seams containing fire damp that had previously been inaccessible. It was a tool that saved lives and expanded the industry simultaneously. At precisely the same time, working entirely independently, George Stephenson at Killingworth Colliery arrived at a remarkably similar lamp through practical experiment. A dispute over priority arose and became somewhat bitter. Davy, with the prestige of the Royal Institution, largely prevailed in the public debate. Stephenson went on to become one of the fathers of the steam railway. Ventilation was the other great challenge of mine management. Air underground needed to circulate, fresh air drawn down one shaft, stale and potentially gas-laden air expelled through another. One early method was a furnace burning at the base of the upcast shaft, whose rising hot air drew ventilating currents through the mine, like a chimney drawing a fire. Ventilation doors, tended by the young trappers mentioned earlier, directed those currents toward the working faces, where men were producing coal, and away from dead ends, where gas might accumulate. The combination of the safety lamp, improving ventilation practice, better roof support techniques, and increasingly detailed mapping of underground workings made the industry somewhat more predictable than it had been in its most dangerous decades. Life below ground remained hard, and accidents continued: roof falls, gas accumulations, flooding. But the direction of change was toward greater care and greater understanding, arrived at slowly and practically, one improvement at a time. Chapter 9. Railways, Gaslight, Coal City. The canals had served well, but they had their limits: the freezing winters, the slow pace, the disconnected network, the different gauges that prevented boats from moving freely across the whole system. They were a good solution for their time, but they were not the final one. The railways changed everything. Coal had played a practical role in the earliest development of rail transport, long before railways became famous for passengers and speed. Underground, in the mines themselves, wooden rails and later iron rails had been used for generations to move loaded tubs from working faces to the shaft bottom. Above ground, horse-drawn wagons running on iron rails, called wagonways, had been used in the northeast of England for many years to carry coal from pit heads to the River Staithes. These wagonways were the direct ancestors of the modern railway. John Blenkinsop designed steam locomotives in 1812 to haul coal from Middleton Colliery in Leeds. the first commercially viable steam-powered railway in the world. They hauled 90 tons at 4 miles per hour, at a time when the Napoleonic Wars had made horses scarce and expensive. George Stephenson visited and observed. The lessons he took fed directly into his own work. By 1825, the Stockton and Darlington Railway opened. By the 1850s, railways had replaced canals as the primary method of transporting coal and goods across Britain, faster, more reliable, regardless of weather, and integrated into a national network in ways the canal system had never achieved. The coal gas industry developed alongside all of this, turning coal into something else entirely, a fuel for light. When coal is heated in sealed retorts without oxygen, it does not burn. Instead, it releases gas, mostly hydrogen and methane and carbon monoxide, which can be collected and piped away. This coal gas burns with a clear and steady flame, and the residue left in the retort is coke, the same material Abraham Darby had used a century earlier to smelt iron. From the early years of the 19th century, gas was piped through underground mains to street lamps, replacing the oil lamps that had previously provided the only illumination on city streets after dark. Streets that had been genuinely dark on winter evenings became lit with a soft, relatively steady light. Shops could stay open longer. People could move through cities at night with greater confidence. Later, gas was piped into homes and businesses, burning in mantle burners that produced a bright, clean light far superior to candle or oil lamp. The city that emerged from coal, steam, iron, and gas was a particular kind of place. Over 100 cotton mills in Manchester by the 1850s, their chimneys rising above the rooftops, the air heavy with smoke. The red brick terraced streets built for the workers in those mills, many of which still stand in Greater Manchester, were a landscape defined by coal in a direct sense. Heated by it, surrounded by its smoke, kept in motion by its energy. Cities close to coalfields, economic research has established, grew significantly more rapidly after 1750 than those at a distance, as people moved toward the employment that coal-powered industry generated. Chapter 10. Coal Communities. There is another dimension to coal's history that belongs not in the world of engines and economics, but in the streets and houses and chapels and meeting rooms of the communities that grew up around the coal industry. A colliery village had its own particular texture and rhythm. The pit dominated the landscape and the calendar. The headframe above the shaft was the first thing you saw coming down the road toward the village, its outline distinctive against the sky. The sound of the winding engine, lowering the cage to the working level and raising it again, was background to daily life, heard at intervals throughout every shift. Men worked in shifts, and the rhythm of the working week was defined by those shifts. Mining communities in Britain developed strong collective identities, shaped in part by the shared nature of dangerous work, where a man depended on his colleagues not just for productivity, but for his safety, and in part by the particular culture that grew up around trade unions, nonconformist chapels, working men's clubs, and cooperative societies. The Durham Miners' Gala, held annually in the city of Durham, brought pit villages together in a day-long celebration combining brass bands, banners embroidered with Union imagery, speeches, and the simple pleasure of neighbors from different villages meeting in the same place. It was festive and serious at the same time, and it has continued long after the closure of the last Durham colliery. By 1900, over 7% of all working-age men in Britain were employed in coal mining. These were not peripheral communities on the margins of the economy, they were central ones, producing a fuel that everything else depended upon. Women in mining communities maintained the household, raised children, often kept kitchen gardens and small animals that supplemented the diet. They managed budgets carefully through the variable wages and occasional layoffs that characterized the industry. They played a role in the social life of their communities, in chapels, cooperative stores, schools, sick funds, and benefit societies that extended well beyond the purely domestic. The figure of the pit widow, encountered too frequently in the records of these places, is part of this story too. A woman whose husband had died underground, left to raise children alone on whatever provision the community could offer. These communities asked a great deal of the people who lived in them. They gave a great deal back in return, in solidarity, in shared purpose, in a culture of mutual support that was built carefully over generations. Chapter 11. Coal at Sea and Across Empire. British coal did not stay in Britain. From the early centuries of the coastal coal trade, when collier ships carried Tyneside coal southward to London around the headlands of the North Sea coast, the sea had been integral to coal's distribution. By the 19th century, as the British Empire expanded and British industry supplied machinery and goods to much of the world, coal found its way into the holds of steamships crossing the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. Those steamships ran on coal. The management of a ship's coal supply, how much was needed for a given voyage, where coaling stations could be found along the route, was a constant concern of naval and merchant shipping. The great expansion of steam-powered shipping from the mid-19th century onward required coaling stations at strategic points around the globe. Aden, at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, lay on the route between Europe and India through the Suez Canal. Gibraltar controlled the entrance to the Mediterranean. Singapore guarded the straits between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. These places mattered strategically because coal mattered logistically. Without regular supplies at the right intervals, the steam-powered arteries of empire could not function. Welsh steam coal from the valleys of South Wales had a reputation for quality, particularly its high calorific value and low sulfur content, that made it sought after for use in ships' boilers. Cardiff became one of the busiest coal-exporting ports in the world by the late 19th century. The coal arrived from the valleys by rail, was loaded onto vessels in the docks, and departed for ports across the globe, to South America, to the Mediterranean, to South Africa, to India, to Australia. The valleys that produced it were among the most intensively mined landscapes on Earth, their terraced communities stacked along narrow valley floors, the winding gear and coal tips defining the skyline as completely as church steeples defined the skylines of older towns. From the perspective of a miner in the Rhondda Valley, working a seam hundreds of feet below ground, the global reach of that coal was perhaps not much in mind. The immediate realities of the working day, the cut of the seam, the quality of the air, the ride up in the cage at the end of the shift, were more pressing than the eventual destination of the material he had produced. And yet what he cut with his pick eventually became warmth and motion and light in places he would never see, in the boilers of ocean steamships, in the factories of distant cities, in the hearths of households on the other side of the world. There is something quietly remarkable about that chain of consequences stretching from a dark seam underground to points so distant and so varied. Chapter 12. Long Decline. Coal's dominance did not end suddenly. it faded gradually over many decades, shaped by the economics of competing fuels, by the depletion of the most accessible seams, and by the discovery and development of oil and natural gas in sufficient quantities to displace coal from its position at the center of the energy system. Oil and natural gas began to replace coal as the primary energy sources from the 1950s onward. Coal's dominance as Britain's main fuel had lasted from the mid-18th century to that point, roughly 200 years. By the year 2000, coal supplied only around 19% of Britain's energy, compared with nearly 31% from oil and nearly 40% from natural gas. The great coal fields that had powered the Industrial Revolution were still present in the ground, but the economics of extracting coal from ever deeper seams, combined with competition from imported coal available at lower cost, made much of Britain's remaining deep mining unviable. At the point of nationalisation in 1947, when the coal industry passed from private ownership into public hands, there were 1,503 collieries in operation across Britain. Over the following decades, that number fell steadily as worked-out seams were abandoned, older and uneconomic pits were closed, and the economics of the industry changed around it. The closures of the 1980s and the long and bitter dispute between the miners' union and the government in 1984 and 1985 accelerated this process dramatically. By 2015, Kellingley Colliery at Nottingley in Yorkshire, the last deep coal mine in Britain, closed its gates. The Northern Mine Research Society records more than 23,000 collieries across the British Isles over the whole history of the industry. Kellingley was the last. The end of deep coal mining was not experienced as an abstraction in the communities that had organized their lives around the industry. The closures were experienced as profound and dislocating changes, not just to employment, though that was serious and immediate, but to culture, identity, and the sense of continuity that a working community carries across generations. These were places where a family's connection to the pit might run back 4 or 5 generations, where the vocabulary of the industry, the names of seams, the terms of underground work, was part of everyday speech, and where the sudden absence of the winding gear and the shift whistle left a silence that was difficult to fill. The pollution that coal produced over its long reign was also real, and it is worth acknowledging this quietly. Research has found that industrial coal use explains around 1/3 of the urban infant mortality penalty in the 1850s. Coal pollution had measurable effects on the health of those who breathed it throughout their lives. The smoke that rose from factory chimneys across Manchester and Sheffield and Birmingham was not benign, and the British government was slow to address this. The consequences were borne most heavily by those who lived nearest the chimneys and had the least ability to remove themselves from the smoke. These facts sit alongside the other facts: the warmth coal provided to millions of cold homes, the employment it gave to communities that had few alternatives, the extraordinary expansion of productive capacity that it made possible, not as a condemnation, but as a part of the full and honest picture of what coal meant to Britain. A material that provided and harmed, and whose full legacy is still being reckoned with, quietly, in the landscape and in the communities it once sustained. Chapter 13. Quiet Closing by the Cooling Hearth. We have come a long way tonight, from ancient tropical swamps where enormous plants fell into slow water and began their long transformation into something hard and black and dense with stored energy. through the centuries when people first noticed coal on hillsides and began to carry it home, through the bell pits on overgrown hillsides and the drift mines driven into valley sides, through the development of deeper mines and the patient work of generations of hewers and putters and trappers working in the particular quiet of underground space, through the ingenuity of engineers, Newcomen, Watt, Davy, Stevenson, who found ways to use coal's energy more safely and more effectively, through the canal boats and the coal staithes and the railway wagons and the mill engines and the gas lamps, through the close-knit communities that built their lives around the colliery and the chapel and the brass band, and held together through decades of shared and difficult work. And now we arrive at the quiet evening side of this long story. The seams still lying underground, unworked now, below the fields and the housing estates and the country parks that were once pit tops. The headframes long since removed, wildflowers growing on ground that was once a colliery yard. The landscape gradually returning to something that does not immediately announce what happened beneath it for 200 years. There is something almost meditative in thinking about coal's trajectory across such a long span of time. It was formed slowly, over geological periods that no human can truly feel in their bones. It was used over a relatively brief period, a few hundred years, significant in human terms, but a flicker in the time scale of the Earth. And it has retreated, not vanished, but stepped back, while the world slowly reorganizes itself around different sources of energy. History is full of these long rhythms, materials that mattered enormously for a time, then gave way to something else, their traces remaining in the landscape and in the memory of the people who lived alongside them. The hearth that represented warmth and continuity for Anglo-Saxon families, for Tudor households, for Georgian parlours and Victorian drawing rooms, that hearth still has meaning, even if the fuel that burns in it has changed. We gather around fires still, in whatever form they take. We find something settling in a low flame in a quiet room. Whatever the source of that feeling, something ancient in us, a cultural memory passed through countless generations, or simply the animal pleasure of warmth and light in a dark space, it connects us to something very long. Coal's story is not one that asks for drama or judgment tonight. It is a story of geology and patience, of human ingenuity and human need, of communities and craft, and the slow accumulation of consequences across generations. It is the kind of history that repays quiet attention, that does not resolve neatly into a single lesson, but settles into the mind gently, the way an evening settles into dark. Here, in this still room, with the evening deepening and the fire burning very low. The embers are glowing gently now, orange and amber, settling into themselves. The room is warm and quiet. If evenings like this one, slow, calm, historically minded, are something you appreciate, there is a gentle way to help this channel continue. You can subscribe to The Quiet History Room on YouTube, free of charge, so these episodes find their way to you whenever a new one appears, and so other people who might enjoy this kind of quiet history can discover that it exists. There is no obligation at all, but if it feels right, it is warmly appreciated. Thank you for spending this evening with coal, and with the patient, unhurried story it has to tell. Good night, and sleep well.